Hello, this is Jeffrey Williams, and welcome to Too Late for the Gods. Today we look at a video on the Capturing Christianity channel in which a writer named Tom Holland appears as a guest. Holland recently published a book titled Dominion, which attempts to argue that Western culture owes its entirety to Christianity and that we have no connection to ancient Greece and Rome, let alone pre-Christian European paganism. Or as Cameron Partuzzi introduces it,
the core idea here is that that our contemporary Western moral and social norms are the product of the Christian revolution of the mind. The Greeks and Romans are, in ethical terms, as remote from us as giant.
This book was enthusiastically received in the apologetics community, but generally ignored by everyone else. So I never considered making the effort of commenting on the entire book. But this video encapsulates the major thrust of the book in a way that makes its refutation more manageable. As some of you know, I've written in favor of the opposite case, that Christianity interrupted European culture as a strange Near Eastern religion grafted onto the body of Western civilization. It became malignant and was eventually rejected by the West's lymphatic system as an unhealthy growth. This rejection began in the late Renaissance as a reconnection to classical antiquity, as well as pre-Christian paganism, as we see in Shakespeare, and the return of our gaze from a metaphysical heaven to man himself as the measure of the world. This trend accelerated with the reason and empiricism of the Enlightenment and finally threw off the diseased graft of Christianity in the late 19th century with Nietzsche's Madman announcing God's death. I've linked below to a couple articles I wrote on this subject for John Mark Reynolds' Eidos. We start with Holland's preface of his arguments with a catalog of ideas and morals which he thinks demonstrates a complete break with pre-Christian antiquity.
And the more I reflected on the Roman world, the Greek world, the stranger they came to seem. And it's not just in terms of values, it's also in the most kind of fundamental way. Things like attitudes to sex, attitudes to gender, attitudes to society, all kinds of things we take for granted. I came to realize they're actually simply not present in the pre-Christian world. And so I became more and more alert to the fact that there'd been this great process of change. And I came to realize that actually what had channeled and provided the impetus for this process of change was Christianity itself. But the Christianity isn't a kind of static thing. It's not a monolithic structure that simply exists. It's incredibly fluid. It's evolving all the time. And I come to see that as being pretty essential to what Christianity is about.
There are two interesting things here. First is his focus on sexuality. It is not entirely clear what the biblical sensibility is on sexuality, but it is clear that the West has loosened the modern Christian church's grip on our understanding of it as it evolves into a more enlightened, less superstitious, and less ignorant understanding of sex. More important is his second claim that Christianity is not static, but evolving. I will make much of that point later, but here I'll suggest that perhaps this evolution he perceives is actually a rejection of Christianity and a move in a very different direction. He begins his first argument that our notions of good and bad are inherently Christian by making the curious argument that new atheists are themselves acting within the framework created by Christianity.
The argument of the book is that our understanding of what is good and bad are essentially Christian ones, and there are very different ways of understanding it. And I think that the atheism of the more, let's call it, evangelical kind, so the Richard Dawkins, Sam Harris kind, is itself, I think, fundamentally Christian. And the reason for that is that a contempt for superstition, a desire to topple idols, a conviction that people who walk in darkness should be brought into light, and that if they're brought into light, they will thereby be saved from the demons of darkness, of course, is a fundamentally Christian one. I mean, it goes back before Christianity to the Hebrew prophets, where Isaiah or Jeremiah are essentially telling the Egyptians or the Babylonians that what they worship, isn't true, and that there is nothing divine about, say, springs or fountains or woods.
This is a clear case of projection. It's as if he cannot imagine the pursuit of truth and elimination of ignorance outside of the framework of Christianity. But all philosophers of Greek antiquity pursued truth and advocated for their positions. In the 5th century BCE, Democritus, along with his teacher Leucippus, set out to detach the pursuit of truth from religion and establish what was probably the first true appearance of science. Democritus had traveled to supposed sites of religious miracles and events and found it impossible for the stories to have happened in these locations. Democritus then adopted the view that all truth is found purely in the physical world and developed the first theory of atoms as the basic structure of the universe. This was done with no knowledge of the Jewish scriptures, which anyway had none of the progressive science and refutation of religious myths found in this Greek philosopher. The new atheists, along with all atheists really, are clearly in the Greek philosophical tradition and well accord with Democritus, and not within some Christian framework. It is simply absurd to appropriate search for truth, refutation of gods, and advocating one position as the sole realm of Christian proselytizing. He then goes on to appropriate all of Western science as Christian in its origin and essence.
So many words in the English language have been dipped into the bath of Christianity, and they're absolutely saturated with it. And science is one of those words. Science, in the sense that we use it now, really only takes on the current signification in the second half of the 19th century. The category doesn't exist before that. So to talk about, Greek science or Chinese science or Egyptian science is completely anachronistic. It's like saying that Julius Caesar invaded and conquered France. You kind of get the point, but it's not accurate. So where does our modern idea of science come from? Well, it clearly, again, it's all about evolution, and it surprises me that say evolutionary biologists are so often hostile to the idea that they themselves might be descended from a very contingent series of beliefs.
He bases his claim that Western science is essentially Christian on a silly word game. Science has existed in the West since at least Democritus, although it had gone under several names. In the English-speaking world, science had been seen as a branch of philosophy under the heading of natural philosophy, until the 19th century, when William Whewell began to refer to natural philosophers as scientists. However, since the time of Francis Bacon in the late Renaissance, the scientific method had been formalized, and Whewell's changing of the name had no effect on the practice itself. In fact, there is nothing Christian about the word science at all. It comes from pre-Christian Latin and had been used in England since the 14th century as the general pursuit of knowledge, so there's nothing particularly 19th century about it either. There simply is no basis to Holland's claim that science is bathed in Christianity. This can be further seen in his statement that science relied on evolution of Christian thought, another thoroughly baseless claim. It is true that science evolved by continuously building on previous thought, but thought of a decidedly non-Christian nature. As I alluded to in the introduction, the Renaissance ushered in the beginning of the rejection of the graft of Christianity. Humanity's gaze switched from the metaphysical to the physical, and Bacon brought about the seminal change in how we approach discovery. Before the Renaissance, rationalism held sway, and that is the scholastic metaphysics, which considered only ideas stemming from God as truth and argued deductively from these a priori ideas. Bacon inverted that view to empiricism, which negated metaphysics and argued inductively from observation of the world. This seminal step in the evolution of scientific thought detached knowledge from God and all metaphysics. In the 18th century Enlightenment, this empiricism based on observation and reason matured into a major inflection point in the evolutionary route of science and in a direction fundamentally distanced from Christianity. Nietzsche's madman has in mind this very Enlightenment as the murderer of God, and Western thought at this point was well advanced in its rejection of the Christian graft. This evolution of scientific thought, counter to Holland's claim, eliminated the explanatory need for God just as much as Darwin did. Holland gets himself in further trouble as he attempts to trace science in this medieval scholastic metaphysics against which modernity rebelled.
The sciences, it means knowing in Latin. You can trace the evolution of what we call science back through the Enlightenment, back through the early modern period to the Middle Ages. And essentially, the study of science begins in the medieval universities. And the universities are very novel institutions when they're founded in the 12th century. And they are committed to the idea that God's law can be fathomed. So you have all kinds of lawyers who are fashioning what comes to be called canon law. But at the same time, you have people who apply the assumption that if God has given laws and it's structured then to human beings, then he must also have structured the cosmos with laws. So there is a single source, a single origin point for the laws that govern the cosmos. And human beings can hope to fathom these laws because the evidence of Scripture is that God is willing to submit himself to the idea of covenants. So there's the covenant that the children of Israel have with God, and then there's the second covenant that is that St. Paul announces. So although scholars in the medieval universities are of course entirely content to acknowledge that miracles are possible, that nothing is beyond God, that he can suspend the laws of the cosmos if he wants, nevertheless there is this kind of guiding assumption that an all-powerful God has nevertheless allowed the cosmos to be structured by laws, and therefore it's possible, because human beings are created in the image of God and therefore have been endowed with a spark of divine reason, it's possible for them to fathom these laws. And that is the kind of ideological framework within which scholars in the Middle Ages look at the what they call natural philosophy, the functioning of animals, of minerals, of the cosmos, of the stars, of the planets, and so on.
He describes here the rationalism that Bacon and empiricists later overthrew. The notion that God had created an ordered universe and given man rational ideas to be able to fathom the laws of this ordered universe no longer was a guiding principle in Western science after Bacon. The notion of a God-ordered universe and divine reason breathed its last gasp with Kant and his equating reason as will and will as God. Kant came at the very end of the Enlightenment, when the forces of Romanticism had already been loosed, and this notion was swept away with the tide. Apparently, Holland is unaware of the revolution of Bacon's scientific method in replacing rationalist deduction with empirical induction, and with it the jettisoning of metaphysical presumption of God's order. And as the scientific evolution progressed, the 20th century brought about the final destruction of any notion of an ordered universe. Much to Einstein's chagrin, we learned that God, in fact, does play dice with the cosmos, and as Stephen Hawking quipped, he sometimes throws them where they can't be seen. So yes, Holland was right that science was evolutionary, but in a way that removed Christianity from its method, not in a way that evolved from Christianity. It wasn't until secularism that began in the Renaissance that science made any real headway as it reconnected with European classical roots. But this brings up another interesting aspect of medieval scholasticism. It is really not correct that Christianity eliminated these classical roots. It is more correct to say that Augustine and Aquinas converted Christianity to Western metaphysics. Augustine made Christianity intelligible to Europe by reinterpreting it through a Neoplatonic retelling. The Semitic religions were really not metaphysical in nature, but rather the gods were physical presences among the people, interacting with the physical world and even procreating with women. Yahweh accompanied the Jewish tribe after the Exodus, sometimes residing in the tabernacle and sometimes leading them in the form of a cloud. Neoplatonists, such as Augustine, however, transformed this into a metaphysical speculation of God and his metaphysical unearthly realm. And from Plato, he received the notion of a sinful and fallen physical world versus a perfect ideal realm. And with that, we have the unlikely marriage of two very different worlds, ancient European metaphysics with this strange and primitive Near Eastern religion. What we receive from that as Christianity is not at all the God of the Bible, but a medieval invention. Later, Aquinas would invoke Aristotle and his physics and metaphysics in an attempt to justify and prove the existence of this new and strange God. So again, Holland is right when he says Christianity is a fluid and evolving religion, but one that is uprooted from its Near East origin, transformed through Greek thought, and continued as the invention of European man. And what post-Renaissance Europe went on to reject was not just Christianity, but metaphysics itself. Christianity was one of the things caught up in this metaphysics. However, this rejection of Platonic metaphysics was not a rejection of Greek antiquity, but a reconnection to the pre-Socratic physicalism of Democritus. Holland then attempts to explain the modern conflict between secularism and Christianity as an act of Protestant anti-Catholicism.
But that is a notion that, rather like atheism in the kind of modern Anglo-American form, emerges in England and America as a very Protestant way of seeing the world. And an awful lot of this narrative that there's been a kind of timeless battle between science and religion reaching back through time is basically sublimated anti-Catholicism. So you still get this stuff, and this is the kind of thing that Tim O'Neill is always banging on about, the idea that there was something called science in, say, antiquity that the Greeks had, and it was there was science in the Library of Alexandria, and then the Christians burned it down because of religion. And if only they hadn't done it, we'd have had great science all the way through the Middle Ages, and we'd probably invented space rockets, and we'd be on Alpha Centauri by now. And this is a myth, because without Christianity, we would not have science.
I have no idea who Tim O'Neill is or what myths he thinks he debunks, but here Holland merely repeats his assertion that science did not exist in ancient Greece, but only came about through a Christian evolution of thought starting in the medieval period. An assertion that is simply silly, and which I hope I have adequately refuted here. The truly silly myth here is Holland's claim that any tension today between science and religion is simply Protestant hostility to medieval scholastic Catholicism. As I pointed out, the real conflict was between medieval rationalism with its metaphysical apparatus and empiricism. Protestantism is every bit in conflict today with science as Catholicism, and probably even more so. Next, he makes the ridiculous claim that only Christianity, through the Goldilocks quality of the Christian God of reason and order, enables science to take place, stunningly ignorant of Muslim superiority in science during his vaunted medieval scholasticism.
And so I think, you say, what is it about Christian society that makes it possible? And I think it's this kind of Goldilocks quality of the Christian God, because if you look at, say, the Muslim God basically for the emergence of science is too powerful. The Muslim God does not bind himself with laws. The Muslim God does not have an equivalent of covenants. The assumption among Muslim scholars is that if you drop an apple from a tree, it's not because there is a law that says that the apple must drop from the tree. It's because God is intervening to ensure every time that the apple drops from the tree.
As I pointed out earlier, the notion of a perfectly ordered universe and a rational and law-giving God was proven false long ago and no longer animates much of science. Holland next pivots to a denial of any Greek influence on our moral values today, which he sees purely of Christian origin. As with his argument for science, he claims that there was no concept of secularism until Christianity, with its origins in sacked Rome when non-Christians blamed the fall on the abandonment of the pagan gods.
So, yeah, get back to this question. Why do you think that our moral values are rooted in Christianity, regardless of if you're an atheist or whatever? Why do you think that?
Well, you mentioned secularism, the idea of the secular. And secular, like science, is a word that is often used anachronistically. So you may read a book on, secular values in Greece. If you get a textbook on Greece, you will have a book in which they talk about democracy and the economy, and then they might have one on religion. And it's a separate chapter. And there's this idea that you can separate something called religion off from something that is called the secular. And it's assumed by most people in the West, I think, that this is just, a given. This is just automatic way of understanding the world. Of course, something called the secular exists, but it doesn't. Secular, like science, is absolutely rooted in the seedbed of Christian theology and its evolution over the course of the centuries. And in fact, more than that, the idea of the secular is distinctive to the Latin Western form of Christianity. And essentially, you can kind of pin the origins of it to something that has quite a topical ring at the moment for you in America. Because in 410, Rome is sacked by the Goths. And everyone in the Roman world is completely shocked by this. And those Romans who are not Christian say, well, this is proof that we should never have abandoned the worship of the gods, because traditionally, classically, the Roman understanding of the role of the gods is that they're a kind of insurance policy. And you take out an insurance policy, which they call a religio, which is literally something that binds you to a god. It could be a sacrifice, it could be a feast day, something like that. And you pay the gods this religio, and then the gods will look after you. So clearly, the fact that Rome has been sacked, this shows that abandoning these religiones was a bad thing. This prompts the greatest theologian in the Latin West, Augustine, a bishop in North Africa, to come up with a decisive riposte. And Augustine's riposte is to say there is only one religio, and this religio, which is the religio of the Christian Church, joins human beings to the only source of eternity, which is that of heaven.
The trick here is to constrain the concept of religion to the religios of pre-Christian Rome, ignoring that religio didn't exist in the Bible, which clearly portrays our concept of religion, nor was it a feature of the earlier Greek and Roman religions. Democritus was already busy separating religious construction of a worldview from secular science. Augustine did nothing different from all earlier theologians, which is to proclaim his God as the only true one. He was only one more in an ancient progression of such claims for a multitude of gods. It simply is absurd to limit the split of religion and the secular to the origin of European Christianity. And from this nonsense, he goes on to spin a fantastic narrative free from reality. In the interview, he never really does explain how morality is purely and solely derived from Christianity, perhaps because the actual history of the West would embarrass such a claim. As he admitted before, Christianity has been a fluid and changing religion, but what he obscures is the bulk of this change has been movement away from the Bible, and this is especially so as it concerns morality. The barbaric eye for an eye justice of the Old Testament, borrowed by the Jews from Hammurabi, appears abhorrent to modern moral sensibility. So does the toleration of slavery, commandment of death for heretics and non-believers by stoning, and God-commanded genocide. Instead, Western morality shows a progressive arc toward tolerance, individual autonomy, and freedom of conscience. Contra Holland, while Western Christianity is a fluid and evolving religion, it is hardly the religion of the Jews 2 millennia ago, but an invention of medieval scholastics which once strangled the lifeblood of European civilization and is now in what seems to be its final decline. It is, in fact, our European heritage that defines today's science and morality, some filtered through medieval invention, but ever more through direct reconnection to the original source.